You wake up in a small, windowless chamber that smells of sweat, fear, and olive oil. The stone walls are cold against your bare skin, and you can hear the distant sound of laughter echoing from the main house, the kind of laughter that makes your stomach clench with dread. Your body aches from the events of the previous night, bruises blooming purple and yellow across your ribs like some grotesque flower. The iron shackle around your ankle has rubbed the skin raw, and dried blood flakes off when you move. Footsteps approach, heavy sandals on marble. You know that sound. It's the overseer, coming to prepare you for another day of what they call service. Your hands shake as you reach for the thin tunic crumpled in the corner. You've long since stopped counting birthdays since they brought you here. Time moves differently when you're nothing but property. The door scrapes open, metal against stone, and harsh sunlight streams in. You squint, raising a trembling hand to shield your eyes. The overseer's silhouette fills the doorway, a mountain of muscle and scars. His face is a map of cruelty, carved by years of breaking young spirits. "Clean yourself," he growls, tossing a damp cloth at your feet. The master has guests arriving tonight. Important guests. His eyes rake over your body with the cold calculation of a horse trader. You're going to help entertain them. Your throat constricts. You know what that means. You've known since the first night they dragged you kicking and screaming from your village. Since they told you your family's debts had been paid in the only currency they had left. You. This is the reality for countless young men in ancient Greece. Not the sanitized version taught in schools, where philosophy and democracy shine bright enough to blind us to the shadows behind the marble columns. Behind the symposiums and political debates existed a system that consumed the vulnerable and discarded their humanity like broken pottery. The overseer's words cut through your thoughts. Get up, now. You rise slowly, the weight of your captivity pressing down on your shoulders like a physical burden. What was once your body, free and full of possibilities, is now just another tool for someone else's pleasure, another cog in an oppressive system that never gives mercy. Before you step out into the world that now holds you captive, you can't help but wonder, how did you get here? What was the tipping point? You thought you were safe, living with your family in a village, unaware of the shifting tides of fate. You had no idea how close you were to the edge. Life before captivity was simple, but it was also hard. The village you grew up in lay nestled in a small valley, surrounded by olive groves that stretched as far as the eye could see. The houses were humble, made of mud bricks and thatch, with dirt floors that became unbearably cold in the winter and scorching in the summer. Still, it was a home. You had your family, your father, a quiet but strong man who worked tirelessly in the fields, your mother, who would hum softly as she wove baskets and tended the garden, and your siblings, who played in the dust and ran through the olive groves with the kind of carefree joy only children possess. But even in this serene environment, there was an underlying struggle. The villagers lived on the knife's edge of survival. A bad harvest could mean starvation. A broken limb could mean a lifetime of crippling debt. The constant threat of invasion, of raiders, of war, it was all part of life. But it didn't make it any easier. You didn't know it then, but the balance was fragile. One disaster could undo everything, and then came the drought. For weeks, the sky remained an unbroken expanse of oppressive heat. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth until the crops turned brown, shriveled, and died. The olive trees, ancient and gnarled, began to produce only shriveled fruit, and the barley fields withered away, leaving nothing but brittle, dead stalks. The wells that had been the village's lifeblood began to run dry. The livestock, once a symbol of wealth and survival, grew thin and weak. The village was on the brink of collapse. Your father, ever pragmatic, did what he thought was necessary. First, the livestock was sold. Then, the jewelry, those few precious heirlooms that had been passed down through generations, was traded. When that was gone, when there was nothing left to sell, that's when the decision had to be made. Your parents were faced with a brutal reality. The debts were too great, and the lenders came calling. The choice was no longer about survival. It was about choosing who would live and who would die. The creditors wanted payment, and payment in flesh. The slave merchants arrived like vultures, sensing opportunity. They set up in the village center, their chains and ropes coiled like serpents, their ledgers filled with names and prices. They promised immediate payment for long-term service, 20 years of labor for enough silver to keep a family fed through winter. It seemed like a fair trade, but you were only 12, and you didn't understand the mathematics of desperation. You only understood that your father wouldn't look you in the eye when the merchant came to inspect you. You didn't understand why your mother turned away when the merchant examined your teeth as though you were a horse. You could hear words like promising, good breeding, and suitable for household service, but you didn't understand them yet, not fully. The merchant counted out silver coins into your father's palm. The metal caught the sunlight, gleaming in a way that made you feel sick. Each piece of silver represented a year of your life. Your father's hands shook as he took the money, but he took it nonetheless. Your mother covered her face and wept, but she didn't stop the transaction. They told you it was temporary. They promised you would earn money and return home a man wealthy enough to buy land, perhaps even take a wife. They told you that you would be treated well, that you would learn valuable skills. They painted a picture of opportunity and advancement. The lies fell from their lips like honey from a broken comb, sweet but poisonous. The journey to the city was nothing like you had imagined. The chains around your neck and wrists cut deep, but it was the weight of despair that was the hardest to bear. There were dozens of other boys and young men, all linked together by iron and hopelessness. The older ones barely spoke. They had learned that hope was just another word for future disappointment. The younger ones cried for their mothers, but their voices soon fell silent as they were beaten into submission. You marched through the countryside, but all of it seemed distant. You noticed nothing: the beautiful rolling hills covered with olive groves, the sparkling sea, the soaring eagles overhead. None of it mattered. Your world had shrunk to the length of the chain between you and the boy in front of you, to the rhythm of feet on stone. Your thoughts were consumed with the growing certainty that you would never see home again. At night, they chained you to stakes driven into the ground, where you lay on your side, listening to the muffled sobs of the other boys. The cold earth pressed against you, and the weight of the iron collar around your neck felt like a noose. There was no escape. The slave merchants sometimes brought visitors to inspect their merchandise. They were men of power, wealthy landowners, politicians, and others who saw the slaves not as people, but as property to be evaluated for service. They would check for disease, for strength, for compliance. They examined you as though you were a tool, a piece of livestock. But some of the men, you would learn, weren't interested in strength or endurance. They were looking for something else altogether. When you arrived in Athens, the slave market overwhelmed you with its noise, smells, and sights. It was an assault on your senses. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, sweat, fear, and urine. And somewhere beneath it all, there was an underlying scent that made your stomach turn a kind of rot, not from the earth, but from humanity itself. Hundreds of voices filled the space, people haggling, crying, pleading, commanding. It was a cacophony of desperation, and you were just one of many. But you understood the difference between the life you had left behind and the one awaiting you now when you saw the buyers. They circled you like predators, calculating, measuring, appraising. The older slaves had warned you about them, the men who looked with cold eyes and talked with smooth voices, discussing prices as though they were bargaining for animals, not people. You were cleaned and oiled before your sale. It wasn't out of kindness, but out of necessity. Clean merchandise fetched higher prices. The oil made your skin gleam in the sunlight, accentuating the lean muscles you had developed during the journey. You were positioned with the household slaves, those destined for indoor service, marked for their good breeding, whatever that meant. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the market, describing your age, your physical condition, and your pleasing appearance. The guests were already circling, their calculating eyes taking in every detail of you. You tried not to make eye contact, but their stares burned into you. And then, there he was, Lysander. You didn't know his name at first, but you would learn it soon enough. All you saw now was his satisfied smile as he counted out the silver. His hands were soft, unlike the rough, calloused hands of your father. He was well fed, with the expensive silks of a wealthy man draped over his body. His fingers glittered with rings, and when he looked at you, there was something in his eyes that made your stomach churn. He owned you now, in every sense of the word. And the worst part was that you already understood what that meant. When the transaction was complete, Lysander led you away. His house was vast, larger than your entire village, with marble columns and intricate mosaics depicting gods and heroes. The wealth, the luxury, the opulence, they were a stark contrast to your former life. Servants scurried through the halls, carrying trays of food and wine, moving quickly and nervously. They avoided looking directly at their master, but you saw it in their eyes, the same look you now knew so well, the resigned despair of a slave. The overseer who managed Lysander's estate was named Demetrius. He had been a slave once, like you, but he had worked his way up through intelligence and ruthlessness. Now, he managed the household slaves with a cold precision. He walked you through the house, explaining the rules. You would be fed twice a day, barley porridge in the morning, bread and olives in the evening. You would be given clean clothes once per week, and you would bathe when ordered. You would speak only when spoken to, and you would never look a free person directly in the eyes. And then came the part that made your blood run cold. You will serve the master and his guests in whatever capacity they require. This may involve pouring wine, serving food, cleaning rooms, or providing entertainment. Demetrius's eyes flickered to yours with a cruel glint. He explained the nature of this entertainment with a smile that made your stomach churn. Some slaves, he said, resisted at first, but resistance only led to pain. Compliance, on the other hand, could lead to certain privileges, better food, a warmer place to sleep, perhaps even small personal possessions. You were led down to the basement where the slaves lived. It was dark, cold, and oppressive, with small cells where each slave slept on a thin straw mattress, a blanket that barely kept the chill away, and a chamber pot that they were forced to use in the dead of night. The walls were thick stone, designed to muffle sound, but that only served to highlight how much of the cruelty was hidden from the outside world. The other slaves in the basement greeted you with a mixture of sympathy and warning. Marcus, a boy about your age, had been there for 2 years. His eyes held depths of pain that seemed impossible for someone so young. Alexios, older and scarred, whispered to you about the special guests who visited the house and what they expected from the entertainment. And then there was Fileman, a boy no older than 14, his face haunted by a world far beyond his years. He had once been the son of a small merchant family until his father's business failed, and creditors seized everything, including the children. Fileman was the one who explained to you the real nature of the symposiums, the drunken gatherings of philosophers, politicians, and wealthy men. These were not the noble affairs of intellect and art they had been sold to you as. They were cruel, debauched displays where the wealthy, the intellectuals, the philosophers of Athens, would use the slaves in ways that had nothing to do with philosophy or debate. They were tools of entertainment, of indulgence. Fileman had learned early, just as you would, that the symposium was not about philosophical discussions, but about control, power, and the degradation of others. It was a place where men like Lysander and others could get away with things that, outside these walls, would have been punishable by death. But here, under the guise of intellectual discourse, the slaves were nothing more than tools for their whims. Your first night at the symposium was the beginning of the end of everything you had once known about yourself. The night of your first symposium in Lysander's house was unlike anything you had ever imagined. The guests arrived in their fine robes, laughing and talking as they settled around the ornate couches that lined the grand hall. The smell of wine filled the air, mingling with the scent of olive oil and roasted meats. Music played softly in the background, but it was overshadowed by the murmurs of men discussing philosophy, politics, and art intellectual topics that now seemed like a cruel joke to you. At first, you thought you would simply serve the food, pour the wine, and stand silently by the walls as the guests debated. But then, as the evening progressed and the wine flowed freely, the conversation began to shift. The men became more relaxed, their speech slurring slightly, their eyes darkening with desire. The philosophical discussions, once high-minded and lofty, turned into crude jokes and boastful challenges. And it was then that you realized this was not the symposium you had imagined. You were not here to serve in the traditional sense. You were here to be used. One of the guests, a middle-aged man with a bald head and a thick beard, looked at you with predatory interest. His eyes raked over your body as he gave you a languid smile. "Come here," he beckoned, his voice low and commanding. "Pour me some wine." You obeyed without hesitation, the glass trembling in your hand as you offered it to him. He took it without thanks, his gaze never leaving your face. "Tell me," he began, "where do you come from? Tell me about your village, about your family." His hand rested on your shoulder as he spoke, and you instinctively recoiled, though you dared not show it. The question was harmless enough, but you felt the weight of it. The touch of his hand, though innocent in appearance, was laden with something darker. It made your skin crawl. Still, you tried to smile and keep your composure. You answered as best as you could, your voice shaking as you recounted the details of your former life. But all the while, you could feel his hand creeping lower, shifting from your shoulder to your back, then to your waist. The others at the table began to laugh, their voices loud and drunken. One man, a younger guest with a thin mustache, slapped his knee in amusement. "Isn't he a fine specimen?" he commented, his words slurring. The others chuckled, and the man on the couch, still holding you with his hand, pulled you closer. "You must be tired of standing," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "Come, sit with me." At that moment, something inside you snapped. The realization that you were no longer a person, but an object to be used and discarded, crushed any lingering remnants of hope. You tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, and the laughter of the others grew louder. You were trapped. The other slaves had warned you about this. But hearing the stories and living it were two entirely different things. You were too young, too naive to fully comprehend what this meant. The symposium, the so-called philosophical discussions, they were nothing more than a cover for the exploitation and degradation of people like you. The men who prided themselves on their intellectual prowess, who discussed justice and virtue, had no qualms about treating you as less than human. They didn't care about your past, your name, your identity. To them, you were just a body, a piece of flesh to be enjoyed. As the night wore on, you were forced into roles you never could have imagined, pouring wine, serving food, and eventually becoming the very entertainment these men had come for. The discussions about virtue, about justice, about the ideal state, none of it mattered. The hypocrisy of it all hit you like a wave. These men who prided themselves on their moral superiority, on their intellectual sophistication, were nothing more than monsters hiding behind the mask of philosophy. You were no longer just a slave in the physical sense. You had become a commodity, a tool for their indulgence, and the worst part was that you began to realize how normal it was for them, how easy it was to overlook the suffering of those who served them. You were part of a world where cruelty was normalized and justified, a world where the strong thrived on the suffering of the weak, and where the veneer of civilization covered the rot beneath. By the end of the night, when the guests had drunk their fill and stumbled off to their private chambers, you were left alone in the shadows, your body bruised, your spirit broken. The laughter of the guests still echoed in your mind, and you couldn't escape it. You couldn't escape the memory of their hands, their eyes, their words. They had taken something from you that night, something that would never return. It wasn't just your innocence. It was your humanity. The days after that first symposium blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the next. You learned quickly that the key to surviving was compliance. Resistance brought pain, but submission offered at least the possibility of less suffering. You watched the other slaves, observing how they moved through the house, how they spoke, how they kept their heads down, avoiding the gaze of their masters and the guests. You began to mimic them, softening your movements, lowering your voice, and fading into the background as much as possible. But even as you adapted to this new way of existing, something inside you was eroding. Your body learned to respond automatically, moving when spoken to, obeying commands without thought, without hesitation. The physical abuse continued, but it was no longer surprising. It became a constant, something to expect with each new guest, each new symposium. The overseer, Demetrius, was a constant presence, watching, guiding you with cruel precision, making sure you performed your duties without error. His sharp eyes seemed to penetrate through you, understanding your thoughts before you had the chance to act on them. But it wasn't just the physical abuse that wore you down. It was the psychological toll, the slow, insidious destruction of your spirit. Every day, you woke up, put on the same tunic, and went through the same motions. You cleaned the house, prepared the food, served the guests, and then returned to your cell at night, exhausted, empty. You became adept at reading the subtle cues of your masters, anticipating their needs before they voiced them. It was a skill, a survival mechanism, but it came with a price. You began to withdraw, to retreat into yourself, to disconnect from the world around you. You stopped caring about the food you were given or the discomfort of your chains. The small acts of rebellion that had once been so important, hiding scraps of food, making eye contact with another slave, became meaningless. You had learned that survival meant disappearing, becoming as invisible as possible. You had learned how to bend, to twist, to make yourself small, to become a thing that could be ignored, a thing that could be used but never seen. But despite your efforts to remain detached, you couldn't escape the moments when your humanity resurfaced. There were flashes, brief, fleeting moments when you remembered what it was like to be a person, to feel the wind on your skin, to laugh with your family, to dream of a future. Those memories haunted you, gnawing at your soul when you were alone, when the sounds of the household grew quiet and you were left to your thoughts. But you quickly learned not to dwell on them. You couldn't afford to. The pain of those memories would only slow your descent into numbness. Still, there were moments when you couldn't help but observe the others, the older slaves, the ones who had been here longer. Some of them had broken completely, their eyes hollow, their bodies limp, moving only when commanded. Others had found ways to survive, to maintain their dignity in the face of constant degradation. Marcus, the boy who had been there for 2 years, had learned to please Lysander's wife, earning himself the role of personal servant. His life was easier than yours, but it came at a cost. He had traded his soul for the comforts of a warmer bed, a softer life. And then there was Alexios, the older man who had been broken by years of abuse. He was tough, scarred from countless beatings, but there was still something in his eyes that suggested he hadn't given up completely. He would often pull you aside when no one was looking, offering quiet words of advice. "Don't show them too much," he would say, his voice hoarse from years of speaking only when spoken to. "If you do, they'll break you. They want to see you bend, but never break." You didn't understand at first, but as the weeks turned into months, you realized that Alexios was right. The overseers, the guests, they didn't want just obedience. They wanted something more. They wanted you to surrender everything, to make yourself small, to erase the last remnants of who you were. Those who complied, who became invisible, were rewarded with slightly better treatment. But those who resisted, even in the smallest ways, were punished. It was a twisted form of survival. You learned that by becoming less, by erasing yourself, you could survive. But that survival came at the cost of your soul, your identity, and any hope for a future. The price of compliance was steep, but it was the only way forward. And yet, even in the darkest moments, there were whispers. The older slaves would talk to each other in hushed tones, sharing stories of rebellion, small acts of defiance, of resistance, a stolen moment of kindness, a shared glance, a whispered story of home. They were fragile, these moments, like the flicker of a candle in a storm. But they were there, and for a fleeting instant, you remembered what it meant to be human, to live outside the confines of your chains. But those moments were few and far between. They were crushed beneath the weight of survival. You had learned that, above all, you must survive. Everything else, dignity, hope, humanity, was secondary. The question was no longer whether you could escape, but whether you could endure. As the months wore on, you began to notice the complexities of the hierarchy that existed within Lysander's household. It wasn't just about obedience, it was about power, control, and survival. The other slaves were not all equal. Those who had been there the longest, like Marcus and Alexios, had managed to carve out their own small niches within the system. They had learned how to navigate the treacherous waters of captivity, how to avoid the worst of the punishment while still fulfilling their master's demands. Marcus, now a personal servant to Lysander's wife, lived a life far better than yours. He had a warmer bed, more regular meals, and even the privilege of being given new clothes from time to time. He had traded his soul, however, for these comforts. He did what was asked of him without question, his body and mind molded into the perfect servant. The others, those less favored, were not so lucky. They worked in the fields or served in the kitchen, their lives marked by exhaustion, brutal discipline, and a constant fear of punishment. Alexios, on the other hand, had been in the house the longest, and though he had survived longer than most, it was clear that the years of abuse had worn him down. His face was a map of scars, his body a testament to the brutal treatment he had endured. But there was a sharpness in his eyes, a strength in his silence. He had learned to hide his pain, to retreat into himself, to become a shadow of the man he once was. You saw how they all moved through the house, Marcus, with the practiced ease of someone who had learned how to please. Alexios, with the resignation of someone who had long ago given up hope. But it wasn't just them. There were others, 2 young boys who had just arrived, like you once had, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They were the new blood, fresh and vulnerable, and their bodies were treated with a brutal efficiency by the overseers. The guests who visited Lysander's house would always look at them with a certain kind of hunger in their eyes, their movements predatory and calculating. The house was a microcosm of the society beyond it, a society built on exploitation, where the weak were preyed upon and the strong thrived on their suffering. The overseers were the enforcers, the ones who kept the system in place, ensuring that the slaves remained compliant and broken. They were just as much a part of the hierarchy as anyone else, but their power was different. They weren't slaves, but they were still bound to the whims of their masters. Demetrius, for example, had risen from the ranks of the slaves, but his ruthlessness made him one of the most feared figures in the house. He knew how to break spirits and keep the slaves in line, and he did it with a cold precision that sent shivers down your spine. You quickly learned that survival here was a delicate balance. It wasn't just about doing the work or following orders, it was about knowing where you fit in the system, understanding your place, and knowing how to move within it without drawing too much attention. The more you complied, the more you disappeared into the background, the safer you would be. But even in this system of hierarchical abuse, there was room for small acts of resistance. Alexios once told you, resistance isn't always about fighting, it's about surviving long enough to see the next day. The key is knowing when to bend and when to break. It was a chilling thought, the idea that your survival depended on your ability to compromise your humanity, to become less than a person in order to endure. But it was true. The longer you stayed, the more you realized that the most effective way to survive was to become invisible, to disappear into the very system that sought to crush you. But even as you began to learn the ropes of survival, you couldn't help but notice the emotional toll it took on the other slaves. The youngest boys, still fresh to the system, were the most vulnerable. They had not yet learned the rules of survival, and it didn't take long before they were broken. Some tried to escape, only to be recaptured and beaten into submission. Others simply gave up, retreating into themselves and becoming hollow shells of what they once were. The more you observed, the more you understood that this was the true horror of the system, not just the physical abuse, but the way it slowly wore down the spirit. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant humiliation, it all conspired to rob you of everything that made you human. Your name, your identity, your past, none of it mattered here. You were just another cog in the machine, another body to be used, another life to be exploited. But there were still those who clung to their humanity, however fractured it had become. Some of the older slaves, like Alexios, had learned to hide their pain, to bear it silently. They had found ways to survive, not by resisting openly, but by withdrawing into themselves, by becoming invisible to their masters and the overseers. In the end, survival in Lysander's house wasn't about strength or defiance, it was about submission. The more you bent, the longer you lasted. You learned to endure, to shut off the parts of yourself that resisted, and to accept the role that had been thrust upon you. And yet, even as you became more adept at survival, a part of you began to wonder, what had you lost in the process? Could you survive without completely giving in? Could you hold on to some part of yourself, some small piece of your humanity? Or was that a luxury you could no longer afford? As the days turned into weeks, and then months, you fell into a monotonous rhythm in the household. The guests came and went, their laughter echoing through the grand halls of Lysander's house, and you continued to serve them in whatever capacity they demanded. You had been trained in the art of obedience, and it became second nature to you. The simple act of pouring wine, presenting food, or attending to the smallest whims of your masters was no longer a question, it was simply what you did. The rhythm of servitude became a way of life, and the idea of anything else faded into the distance, like a memory from another life. But even as you became adept at your role, a part of you could not suppress the rising resentment that simmered beneath your outward compliance. The guests, the philosophers, the politicians, the men who waxed poetic about justice and virtue during the day, were the same men who used you and others like you for their own selfish amusement at night. They believed that their intellectual prowess gave them the right to shape the world, to define morality, to decree what was virtuous and just. But in their private moments, the facade of sophistication crumbled, and you saw them for what they truly were, animals in human clothing, using their power to control, dominate, and degrade. You witnessed their cruelties in the most intimate ways. They treated you as nothing more than an object for their amusement. The nature of your service went beyond mere servitude. It involved humiliation, exploitation, and the breaking of your spirit. The more they indulged in their lust, the more they demanded, and you quickly learned the horrifying truth. This was not about serving their needs, it was about their desire to control you, to strip you of everything that made you human. One guest, an older man named Cleomenes, who had a reputation for being charitable and kind, was particularly fond of these games. His reputation as a wealthy merchant who funded public works and was praised for his generosity to the poor was well known. But in private, he was a monster. He delighted in humiliating you, his cruel requests pushing you to your limits. His demands were subtle at first, small, degrading tasks that were easy to ignore. But as the evening wore on and the wine flowed, the requests grew darker. He would make cruel jokes, laughing as you were forced to perform humiliating acts, all while he quoted passages from the great poets, as if that could somehow absolve him of his crimes. And then there was Dionysios, the politician who spoke so eloquently about justice and virtue in public, yet at night became a beast, seeking not only physical dominance but psychological control. He would spend hours discussing philosophy, and then, without warning, his hand would fall upon you, as though he had every right to do so. The contrast between the man he pretended to be and the man he truly was became more apparent as the days went by. At first, you fought against this reality, your body recoiling when they touched you, your mind screaming in resistance. But the more you were exposed to this treatment, the more you learned to shut it out. You learned that resistance would only bring greater pain, greater humiliation, and so, like the others, you became a silent observer of your own degradation. Your body moved on instinct, your eyes looked downward, and your mind retreated into a dark corner where you could at least find a semblance of peace. You learned that survival, at its core, was about submission. The more compliant you were, the less they would notice you, the less they would hurt you. But it wasn't just the men who controlled you. It was the entire system. The system that made you feel small, unworthy, invisible. The same system that turned you into a tool, a piece of property to be bought, sold, and discarded. It was the same system that made you feel grateful for the smallest scraps of kindness, an extra piece of bread, a warmer place to sleep, a moment of rest between the endless demands. You began to see the other slaves differently too. Some had already broken, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of their captivity. They had surrendered completely, not just to their masters, but to the system itself. They had become shadows of the people they once were. Others, like you, still clung to the faint hope that somehow, somewhere, there might be a way out, a glimmer of freedom. But even that hope was beginning to fade, like the last remnants of a dream fading with the morning light. But there were still moments, still fleeting moments, when you remembered who you once were, the boy who ran through the olive groves, who laughed with his siblings, who dreamed of a future that seemed so far out of reach now. Those memories were dangerous. They reminded you of what you had lost, of what had been stolen from you. They made you long for something that could never be returned. And yet, even in these moments of despair, there was a strange sense of survival that lingered. You had learned to endure. You had learned to hide your pain, to put on the mask of compliance and disappear into the background. You had learned to survive by becoming less than a person, by erasing yourself from the world around you. But survival came with a price. Each day, you lost a little more of yourself. Each night, you gave away a little more of your dignity. And the longer you stayed in this house, the more you realized there would be no escape, not physically, not emotionally. The world you had once known was gone, and in its place, you had become nothing more than an object, a thing to be used, a thing to be discarded when no longer needed. Even in the depths of despair, when the weight of your existence felt like a crushing force, there were moments small, almost imperceptible, when the flicker of defiance burned within you. It was a desperate kind of resistance, not the kind that would overthrow the system, but the kind that allowed you to feel, if only for a second, like a human being again. These acts, however fleeting, kept you from completely succumbing to the darkness. The older slaves had learned, in their own way, how to maintain some semblance of dignity. They had found ways to resist, not through physical confrontation, but through the quiet preservation of their own identities. Marcus, who had been at Lysander's house for years, would often share stories of his village, stories he knew would be lost if he didn't speak them aloud. Alexios, ever the silent one, had a small notebook he kept hidden. In it, he wrote fragments of his life before captivity, a record of a world that no longer existed for him. You began to do the same. It wasn't much, just a few whispered words to the other slaves, a shared glance in the dark, but it was enough. You told stories of the life you had before you were taken, of your mother's garden, of your father's laughter, of the way the wind smelled in the early morning when the olive groves were still wet with dew. These stories, told in hushed tones, were a lifeline. They kept you connected to the life that had been stolen from you. And when you were alone, you would close your eyes and remember the taste of freedom. You would think of the fields where you used to run, the sound of the goats bleating, the sun warming your skin. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the ghosts of your former self alive. But the more you thought about those moments, the more you realized that resistance, even in its smallest forms, was dangerous. The overseers had eyes everywhere. They were trained to spot even the slightest deviation from the script of obedience. If they saw you speak to another slave, share a glance, or worse, whisper a word of defiance, they would punish you. And the punishments were always worse than the crime. One night, during a particularly brutal symposium, the guests had grown so drunk that their cruelty knew no bounds. You were ordered to serve a man named Phocion, an intellectual who had been invited to discuss politics and philosophy with Lysander and the others. But when the conversation turned to more personal matters, he leaned closer to you, his breath reeking of wine. "Tell me," he whispered, his hand moving too close to your body. "What do you dream of, slave? Do you dream of freedom?" You froze. No one ever spoke like this. His voice was smooth, but there was something predatory in his tone. He was testing you, probing for weakness. You knew, deep down, that you should say nothing, that you should remain silent, nod, and move on. But something inside you snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the pain, or maybe it was the sheer absurdity of this world, where men like him could debate the nature of justice and virtue while using slaves like you for their pleasure. In that moment, you answered, your voice quiet but clear. "I dream of being free, of running through the hills, of feeling the wind on my face again." For a brief moment, there was silence. The guests, who had been laughing and speaking in raucous tones just seconds before, suddenly fell quiet. Phocion's eyes narrowed, a look of confusion mixed with amusement on his face. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not by a slave. Before he could respond, Demetrius stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. He looked at you with disgust, his eyes cold as ice. "You'll learn to know your place, slave." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Demetrius never let you out of his sight, and though no physical punishment came immediately, you knew there would be consequences. Demetrius wasn't the type to let defiance slide. He would find a way to break you. It was only a matter of time, but for that brief moment, you had felt it, the flicker of hope, the taste of defiance. It was small, it was dangerous, but it was real. It reminded you that, no matter how far you had fallen, you were still alive, still capable of feeling, still capable of dreaming. That small act of rebellion, no matter how fleeting, gave you strength. Even in the face of the brutality that would surely follow, you understood something. Resistance didn't always have to be loud, and it didn't always have to be seen. Sometimes, it was enough to remember that you were human, that you had a right to dream, even in the darkest of places. It was a night like any other when the realization first struck you, a clarity that came not with anger, not with hope, but with a terrible, bitter understanding. You had been in Lysander's house long enough to see the patterns, to understand the games the masters played. You had learned the rules, and you had learned the cost of survival. But something in the air had changed that evening. It wasn't just the drunken laughter of the guests or the usual cruelty of the overseers, it was the way they spoke about their world, their lives, their power. The symposium that night was different. It was quieter, more reflective. The guests were older, seasoned men who had seen the rise and fall of many others like you, slaves and freedmen alike. They discussed matters of philosophy, justice, and virtue, as they often did. But there was an undercurrent tonight, a sense of something deeper, something darker beneath their words. You found yourself standing on the edge of the room, serving wine and listening, as you had done countless times before. The conversation turned to virtue, the nature of it, its place in society. It was a topic that many of these men had lectured on for years, and tonight they were in a particularly intellectual mood. Their words rolled off their tongues with the ease of practiced scholars, but something about their debate stirred something in you. One guest, Dionysios, a prominent politician, spoke with passionate fervor. "Virtue is not inherent," he argued. "It is cultivated, shaped by society and by the laws that govern us. A man who is free because he has the ability to choose virtue. A slave, however, is incapable of such a choice. His very nature binds him to servitude, and thus he cannot be virtuous in the same way a free man can." The other men nodded in agreement, murmuring their approval. The argument was familiar, as old as the idea of slavery itself. Slaves were not capable of virtue because they were bound by their station, by their fate. They were tools to be used, not individuals with the capacity for morality. But for the first time, as you stood there, serving them wine, you felt the weight of those words in a way that was unbearable. You understood that they believed this. They truly believed that you were less than them, that your worth was defined only by the service you could provide. You were no longer a person in their eyes, you were a thing, a possession, an object. To them, the suffering of slaves was justified because they were inherently less, incapable of true virtue, and therefore deserving of their fate. The conversation continued, but you couldn't hear their words anymore. You could only hear the echo of their logic ringing in your ears, the cold, brutal logic that justified everything they did. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and you saw their world for what it truly was, a system built on lies, on a justification of cruelty that allowed men to sleep at night without remorse. They were not ignorant barbarians. They were educated men who had rationalized their evil, and that, you realized, made their cruelty all the worse. You had always known on some level that this was the truth, but it had never been so clear, so undeniable. The hypocrisy of it hit you like a wave. These men, philosophers, politicians, scholars who prided themselves on their knowledge of ethics, of justice, were the same men who, in private, used their power to abuse and degrade those who had no voice. Their philosophy, their discussions about virtue, were nothing more than intellectual exercises to justify the horrors they inflicted. You wanted to scream, to tell them what they were, but you knew better. Resistance was futile, and any outburst would only bring more suffering. Instead, you retreated into yourself, wrapping yourself in the dark cloak of submission once again. You couldn't fight them, but you understood now the world you had entered was not just one of physical chains. It was a world where the mind was enslaved as much as the body. The clarity that came to you that night was not a gift, it was a curse. You saw the system for what it truly was, a carefully constructed web of lies, where the powerful justified their exploitation through intellectual arguments, where the weak were told they were worthless and incapable of anything beyond servitude. But even in the depths of your despair, there was something that stirred within you, a cold, hard truth that you couldn't forget. You were human. And no matter what they told you, no matter how many times they stripped away your dignity, you knew that part of you could never be taken away. The soul they sought to crush, the part of you that still held on to fragments of who you were, no matter how broken that part had become, was still yours. It was the last thing you had left. But the question remained, was it enough to survive on that alone? Could you endure the years of abuse and degradation, knowing that your very existence was the result of a system that had long ago decided that you had no worth? The realization that the system itself was not broken but designed to operate this way, to operate on your misery, on your silence, made the path forward even more uncertain. You understood the truth now, but knowing the truth came at a price. For the first time, you wondered if it was better to have remained ignorant, to have stayed in that blissful fog of submission. As the weeks bled into months, the realization that you were trapped in this hellish existence began to sink deeper. The faces of the guests, once distant and unfamiliar, became regular fixtures in your life. Their whims, their laughter, their cruelty, everything they did felt like a part of the relentless machine that worked to strip away your humanity piece by piece. You were no longer a person. You had become a function, a tool to be used, to serve, to be humiliated and discarded when the master grew tired of you. The days grew longer, and the nights more oppressive. You had learned how to survive, how to keep your head down, how to avoid drawing attention. The rules of compliance were etched into your soul now. You did as you were told, moved when you were instructed, spoke only when spoken to. The art of blending into the background had become second nature, and with it, a sense of numbness began to settle over you. Each day that passed without a punishment felt like a victory. Each time Lysander or Demetrius looked through you, not seeing, not acknowledging your existence, you felt a small, hollow sense of relief. They didn't see you anymore. You were invisible. And in a strange way, that invisibility became a form of safety. But it wasn't freedom. It was survival. And survival at such a cost. The physical pain was constant. The beatings that you had once feared had become a regular occurrence. Every misstep, every slight deviation from the master's orders, warranted a swift punishment. At first, you fought the pain, but now, you had learned to endure it in silence. The bruises, the cuts, the burns, they were just marks, just signs that you were still alive. You no longer screamed, no longer begged for mercy. You had learned that mercy was a luxury you could no longer afford. The emotional toll, however, was far worse. The steady erosion of your sense of self had begun to show. You would find yourself staring at the stone walls of your cell, feeling an emptiness that no amount of sleep could fill. You no longer remembered the last time you had laughed, or the last time you had felt joy. Your memories of home, of your family, had faded into shadows, and the faces of those you had once loved had become distant, like a dream that slipped further away the more you tried to hold on to it. Your body had grown used to the physical abuse, but your spirit was a different matter. Each day, you felt a little less like the boy who had once run through the fields, the boy who had dreamed of a future beyond the olive groves. Now, you were nothing more than a shell, a vessel for their cruelty, a body that moved and obeyed without question. It was during this time, when the numbness had fully settled in, that the realization hit you with a finality that left you breathless. There was no escape. Not from the physical pain, not from the emotional destruction, not from the system that had swallowed you whole. You were trapped, in every sense of the word. But as you reached this final stage of despair, you also noticed something else. You began to notice the other slaves in the house differently. Marcus, though broken in his own way, still carried a glimmer of hope. He had found a way to make himself useful, to survive, and he was willing to pay the price. Alexios, though his spirit was near its breaking point, still had enough strength to offer words of advice, to share a laugh in the dark moments when the overseers weren't watching. They were broken, yes, but they had found a way to live with their brokenness. They had learned to navigate the system, to make their peace with it, even if it meant sacrificing their dignity. And then there were the new boys, the fresh faces that arrived in the house, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. You saw them and felt something stir within you, something you hadn't felt in years. Pity, but also a fleeting sense of connection. They were you, once just a boy, a child, thrust into this world without warning. They hadn't yet learned how to survive. They didn't yet know what the system would do to them, and you knew, deep down, that the cruelty they would face would break them faster than it had broken you. But what could you do? You couldn't protect them. You couldn't save them. You couldn't even save yourself. Instead, you watched as they learned the same painful lessons you had learned. How to become invisible. How to serve without resistance. How to bend and never break. You watched as their eyes began to dull, as their spirits began to wither. You saw the same empty look in their faces that you had once seen in the eyes of the older slaves, Alexios, Marcus, people who had survived only by erasing their souls, by giving up everything that made them human. But the hardest part was yet to come. You realized that survival, for all its tolls, was the only thing left. The system would break you. It would take your body, your spirit, your identity, until there was nothing left. And when it was done with you, it would discard you, like it had discarded so many before you. Yet somehow, as you came to understand this, there was a small, bitter part of you that still refused to completely surrender. You could not stop the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth holding on to. That despite everything, despite the abuse, despite the hopelessness, there was still a part of you that refused to die. A part of you that remembered who you had been before the chains. But that part, you knew, was fading too. As years passed, the line between the boy you once were and the hollow shell you had become blurred. The world outside the household had receded, as though it were a far-off dream, its edges softening with time. You no longer knew where you ended, and the chains began. You had given everything, your identity, your memories, your hopes, and in return, the system had given you survival. But survival, as you had come to learn, was not living. It was simply existing. Each new slave who arrived in the household seemed like a mirror of yourself, a reminder of what you had lost. You watched them, wide-eyed and full of fear, and you saw how quickly they were molded into the system. Some broke within days, others lasted longer, but eventually, they all learned to bend. The younger boys, in particular, caught your attention. They were still innocent, still untouched by the cruelty of the world. But you knew, deep down, what awaited them. You knew that their innocence would be stripped away as surely as yours had been. You had tried, in your own way, to help them. A quiet word here, a piece of advice there, trying to prepare them for what they would face. But you couldn't protect them. You couldn't save them. And in the end, you couldn't save yourself either. You had long ago stopped believing in the possibility of escape. There was no freedom, not in this house, not in this world. The only thing that mattered now was survival, and you had learned to survive. But there were moments, rare, fleeting moments, when you remembered what you had once been. You remembered the taste of freedom, the feeling of running through the olive groves, the smell of your mother's cooking, the sound of your father's voice. Those memories, though faint, were enough to keep you going, to remind you that, at one point, you had been someone, not just a slave, not just an object, but a person, full of life and possibility. And then, one day, you saw something in one of the new boys that made your heart skip a beat. His eyes. They were the same as yours had been when you first arrived in this house, wide with fear, but still full of life, still holding on to something you had lost long ago. His name was Dorian, and he had been brought in from a neighboring village. He was younger than you had been when you first arrived, but there was something about him that reminded you of yourself, something in the way he held himself, something in the way his eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of the world he had been thrown into. For the first time in years, you felt something stir within you, a flicker of hope, of connection. You watched him, and a part of you longed to tell him what you had learned, to warn him of the horrors that awaited him. But you knew better. He would learn on his own, just as you had. He would be molded by the system, just as you had been. But you also knew that he might survive longer than you had, because he still had something you had lost. He still had his spirit. It had not been broken yet, and for that, you envied him. You caught his eye one night, across the room, as he served wine to a guest. He looked at you, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between you, a recognition that you were not alone, that you were both trapped in this nightmare. But it was more than that. It was a brief, quiet acknowledgement of the humanity that still remained within both of you, despite everything that had been done to erase it. The next day, Dorian was gone. No one knew where he had been sent, but his absence left a hole in the rhythm of the household. The guests came and went, the overseers barked their orders, and life went on as it always did. But you couldn't shake the feeling that Dorian had been different, that, somehow, he had managed to hold on to something that you could no longer find within yourself. The thought haunted you for days, and yet, in the back of your mind, you understood the cruel truth. It was too late for you. You were no longer the boy who had run through the olive groves. You had become a thing, a tool, a part of the system that had consumed you. But Dorian, in his innocence, had given you something, if only for a moment, a reminder that even in the depths of captivity, even in the heart of despair, there was still the possibility of something more. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all, that the hope you had once held, the hope you had once clung to, had been swallowed up by the very system that had created it. You no longer believed in freedom, but you could not stop yourself from longing for it. For Dorian, for the person you had been before the chains. But it was just a longing, a fantasy that existed only in the recesses of your mind. The reality was that you were trapped. And yet, in that moment of clarity, when you remembered the boy you had once been, you also remembered the most important truth of all. You were still human. You were still capable of hope, however faint it had become. And that, in itself, was enough to survive. As the years stretched on, the world you had known before, the fields, the olive groves, the laughter of your family became nothing more than distant, faded memories. The stone walls of Lysander's house had become your entire world, and the faces of the guests, the overseers, the other slaves, they were the only faces you knew. The person you had once been, the dreams you once had, felt as though they belonged to someone else. Time had blurred the edges of those memories, and the person you had been before captivity felt more like a dream than a reality. But there was something in the very nature of this existence that continued to eat away at you, something that you couldn't escape, no matter how hard you tried to silence it. It was the awareness that, despite everything you had endured, despite everything you had lost, there was still something inside you that resisted. It was faint, it was fragile, but it was there. A small ember of humanity that refused to be snuffed out entirely. You had survived. You had learned how to bend, how to become invisible, how to please, how to endure. But survival, you realized, was not living. And the cost of survival was steep. The system that had enslaved you, that had taken your family, your identity, and your future, had succeeded in its primary goal. It had stripped you of everything but your body, a body that moved at the will of others. You had been broken, and yet, even in your brokenness, there remained a sliver of yourself that could not be erased. The cruelty of the system, the unrelenting, systemic abuse, had stripped you of your past, your dignity, your soul, and yet it had never fully consumed you. The truth, as you had come to understand it, was that the system didn't just break the body. It broke the mind, the spirit, the very essence of who you were. And it was in the quiet moments when the laughter of the guests faded into the background, when the overseers' voices became a dull murmur, that you understood the most profound truth. Cruelty, once accepted, becomes invisible. It becomes the norm. The masters, the philosophers, the politicians, they were not ignorant. They were well aware of the suffering they caused. But they justified it, rationalized it, and in doing so, they allowed it to persist, to continue. The world that had given birth to such horrors, the world that had fostered the ideas of democracy and intellectualism, of philosophy and virtue, was built on the backs of those like you. Your suffering, your brokenness, was the price of their progress. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate, systemic structure that had been created to serve the powerful at the expense of the powerless. You had been a cog in the machine, a thing to be used and discarded, and yet, even now, years after your spirit had been fractured, you could still see the parallels. It was the same in every society, past and present, where the powerless are hidden behind a veneer of respectability, where the suffering of the few is ignored in order to maintain the comforts of the many. The slave markets of Athens had disappeared, but their legacy had lived on. The institutions of power had changed, but the fundamental truth remained the same. The suffering of the vulnerable was still a currency, a hidden price that paid for the luxuries of the privileged. You had witnessed the intellectuals and politicians, those who praised justice and virtue in public, while in the privacy of their own homes, they reveled in cruelty. Their philosophical debates, their discussions about ethics and governance, had all been tainted by their actions. It was this contradiction, the gulf between their public personas and their private behavior, that had finally pierced through the numbness you had built around yourself. It wasn't that they didn't know right from wrong. It was that they simply didn't care. They had rationalized their cruelty, made it a part of the system, and in doing so, they had normalized it. But in that quiet realization, there was something else. You had survived. You had lived long enough to see the true nature of the system you were trapped in. You had seen the cost of that survival, the loss of your identity, your dignity, your humanity, but you had also seen something else. You had seen that, despite everything, you were still capable of holding on to a fragment of who you were. The system had stripped you of so much, but it hadn't completely erased you. You were still capable of remembering, still capable of hope, even if it was a hope that seemed so distant now. As time passed, the other slaves came and went. Some broke, some survived, some died. The cycle continued, unbroken, and you too continued to serve, continued to endure. But every so often, when you closed your eyes in the darkness of your cell, you remembered the boy you had been, the boy who had run through the olive groves, who had laughed with his family, who had dreamed of a life beyond the chains. And for a brief moment, you allowed yourself to mourn that boy, to grieve for the person you had lost. But then the darkness would fall again, and you would return to your survival, to your submission, to the reality of your captivity. The question of escape was no longer even a thought, it was a fantasy, a dream you had long ago abandoned. You had survived, yes, but at what cost? And as the marble halls of Lysander's house echoed with the laughter of the guests and the sounds of your servitude, you realized that the world outside, just like the world inside, had been built on this very system, a system that thrived on the exploitation of the weak, the suffering of the many to benefit the few. You were a part of that world, a casualty of it. But your story, your pain, your survival was not forgotten. It lived on, passed down through the whispers of those who had suffered, who had endured, and who had survived. You had become a part of the legacy of suffering that underpinned the great civilizations of the past. The marble halls still echoed with your cries, your memories, and the memories of countless others like you. And perhaps, in some distant corner of the world, someone would finally listen to your story. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would remember your name. But until then, you would remain as you were a shadow of the boy you once were, a thing to be used and forgotten. Your humanity had been stolen, but it had not been completely erased. The echoes of your suffering would linger in the silence, a testament to the cost of civilization,